Okay, so today we're going to talk about how to factor a trinomial when your A coefficient is not a 1. We're still working with the same we will. We are going to factor, if possible, trinomials with real factors in the form of A times the value of x squared plus B times the value of x plus C, and this will include perfect square trinomials of degree 2. So remember, to factor a polynomial means we are simply undoing the multiplication to find all of our factors. Now, one thing that you are going to have to make sure that you check for now is you are going to have to check for the GCF, which is why I showed you in the previous lesson how to find the GCF in your calculator if you get stuck, because we are going to need to find that common factor. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into our first example. So we have the trinomial 6n squared plus 72n plus 192. So the first thing we're going to do is we can't jump into any of this until we check for our GCF first. So I'm going to use my calculator. So I'm going to put this up here. And remember, to check for your GCF, you can only type in two coefficients at one time. So we're going to work at the first two coefficients, 6 and 72. So I'm going to math, right arrow 9, 6, comma 72. If your coefficients are negative, remember you cannot put the negative sign in here. You have to use positive coefficients only. And the common factor between 6 and 72 is 6. So since that is their common factor, I'm going to use their common factor with the next coefficient 192. So I'm going to GCF again in my calculator, and I'm going to use my GCF of both 6 and 72, and now I'm going to use the third coefficient of 192. So remember, with three coefficients, you have to GCF twice. And whatever GCF I get from 6 and 192, that's what I'm going to use for my trinomial. And it is 6. So my GCF is 6. So here's how this changes things. Okay, so now 6 is now one of my factors for my trinomial. So down here at the bottom where I have the place to write my factors, I now have to include that 6 as part of my final answer. So I also, before I can start filling in any of this information, I now have to remove or divide out that common factor of 6 from my trinomial, because it's going to make my trinomial a lot easier to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide each coefficient by 6. Well, I know 6 divided by itself is 1, so I'm going to get n squared plus 72 divided by 6, that is 12, so 12n. And now I'm going to divide 192 divided by 6, and that is 32. So when I factor out my GCF, I have in a sense divided each of my coefficients by 6, and that left me with the trinomial 1n squared plus 12n plus 32. That is the coefficient that I'm going to end up doing the box method for and the X games for. Okay, so that's why I wrote it down here. So now I need to fill out my coefficients. So n squared is going to be my A coefficient, and it's going to go here. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. I have 1 and n squared here. Now my constant, I can pick that out pretty easy. It's 32. That's going to be my C coefficient. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in, 32 and plus 32 here. And now I'm going to fill in my B coefficient, and I know that I can't put the 12 in these boxes yet because I'm not quite sure how those like terms are going to be split, but I do know my B coefficient is 12. Okay, so now I'm going to start playing my X games, my X puzzle. So I know that I have to multiply my A and C coefficient, and that gives me a product of 32, and I know my B coefficient is going to fill in the bottom of my X puzzle. And that is what I'm going to get a factor list for, is my A and C coefficient, 32. So I'm going to go to my calculator, and I'm going to say 32 divided by X, and I'm going to go to my table, and I'm going to start listing my factor pairs. So 1, 32, 2, and 16. I'm going to skip over that factor of 3 because it includes a decimal, and then I'm going to go to 4 and 8. And I can skip over 5, 6, and 7 because their factor pairs include decimals, and the next factor pair I would have is 8 and 4, but because I already have them listed, I know that I'm going to start listing repeats, so I am done. And now I'm going to start looking at my options. I've got to be able to get to 12 when I combine them, either positively or negatively, so I can add or subtract them to get to 12. And I see 8 and 4. Okay, now I've got to check their signs. So do I need to have a sign change with 8 and 4 to get to a positive 12? And I do not. They both have to remain positive. So now I know that I can put a positive 4 in one box and a positive 8 inside the other to get my like terms, because when I combine them, they are going to get me back to 12n. So now I can start filling in the terms for my rows and columns so I can actually see what are the factors of this trinomial. Well, I know from multiplication that n times n is going to give me n squared. And I now got to think n times what's going to give me 4n. That would be a positive 4. And what times n is going to give me 8n? That would be a positive 8. And then I'm going to check my multiplication again. 8 times 4, does that give me the product of 32? And the answer is yes. So now I know my other factors besides the GCF of 6. My factors are n plus 4 and n plus 8. So I now know that when I factor this trinomial of 6n squared plus 72n plus 192, I actually have 3 factors. I have a common factor of 6, and then I have factors n plus 4 and n plus 8. If I did not include that GCF of 6 in my final answer and I only listed these factor pairs, if I multiplied these back, I would not get this original trinomial. And therefore my answer would be incomplete and would be wrong. So you have to make sure you include that GCF, which is why we look for it first. It just makes our trinomial a little bit simpler and easier to factor when we are filling in our boxes in our X puzzle.